Hello. Today I would like to start a new series of Learning Business Central features. And I have considered many times trying to create a series that discusses all of Business Central essentially like an application training course. But that is actually quite a daunting endeavor and would require me to be much more organized, to go through a curriculum like Jeremy Viska's Your First 20 Hours with Business Central or Eric Hugard's Business Central Field Guide. And it's a big project. So instead, I'm just going to face reality that I don't have that much time and I'm not that organized. And I'm going to try to just do a session on a particular feature as I come across it, as I need to research it. And I know that doesn't appease my desire to have something that is structured and cohesive and incremental and a learning path. But this is my alternative to not doing anything. So with that said, I'm just going to try and share some knowledge about what I've come across and tried to learn. I won't claim to have complete knowledge or learning of these things, but I'm just going to share what I've stumbled across. And let me know if I missed anything, if I got anything wrong, because these are kind of little dark corners of Business Central that I'm not always able to find great information on. I think I found one blog post on kind of one aspect of this, and there are probably a few other articles on it, but it's just not a lot of coverage on this particular topic. And with that, I'd like to thank Jeremy Viska for the cool Business Central application-focused logo. His company is Spare Brained Ideas, and I think he has this logo on t-shirts and stickers and a few other things if you're interested in that. And also it's available as a download for screensavers, so a bunch of different resolutions. So you go to Spare Brained Ideas website and check that out. So thank you, Jeremy. And as I mentioned, he also has a book, Your First 20 Hours with Business Central, I believe. And I haven't had time to look into the book to see how much it covers these particular features. So that's on me. But check that out and see if you can find this stuff in his book. So with that, let me plow on. So this came about because for a particular project, we're trying to understand how do we properly default dimensions on a given sales invoice line. So we are kind of reproducing some functionality that involves like sales order, sales invoice lines. And when we allow a user to add an item to that line grid, how should we default dimensions? Should we default dimensions? If so, how? Where do those defaults come from? And we thought, oh, how hard can it be, right? Well, it turns out there's a lot going on behind the scenes in terms of defaulting dimensions. So do not underestimate that. And we may have stepped into a deeper realm than we intended. And we're considering, okay, do we go full bore on this thing and support all the default dimension functionality? Or do we just scale it back and say, look, we support items and customers. That's it. We're not getting into this other stuff because that gets really crazy. And there are like 7 different angles you can approach this. And yeah, pros and cons. So we're trying to investigate how we deal with that support. So I have a blog post of my initial kind of learning at blog.steveendo.com. And I explored default dimensions and default dimension priorities, which is a separate feature that allows you to prioritize where default dimensions come from. And I'll touch on that as well in this session. But you can check out the blog, get an overview of what's going on, and kind of understand some of your options. It's not comprehensive, but I think it's a good introduction to it. And I found one other blog post out there that talked about default dimension priorities, but it didn't seem to go in quite as into as quite a the same level of depth, shall we say. Okay, so let's talk about default dimensions. What do I mean by that? So if I am entering a new line item on a sales invoice, let's say the two shortcut dimensions or two global dimensions are available as fields on that line item. And if you have, let's say you're working in the Cronus company and you don't have any defaults set up, those two dimension values, those global dimensions or shortcut dimensions, 1 and 2, I'm not quite sure which terminology applies appropriately in that particular case, but they will be blank by default. So if I just grab a random customer, random item, in my testing, those two dimension fields are blank at the line item level. It's like, okay, that's interesting. After some research, I found that those two dimensions, at least, and obviously there could be many more dimensions, up to 8 by default, but those two dimensions, I'll just stick with those two for this example or discussion, those can actually default from the item, from the customer on a sales transaction. If you're on the purchasing side, those can default from a vendor. Those can also default from a GL account if you're working with the GL account at the line level. It turns out, after digging through the Business Central code to figure out how these things are defaulting, we found, well, they can default based on the salesperson or the purchaser configuration. And confusingly, those are called salespeople/purchasers in the US version of Business Central SaaS. I don't know what those are called in other regions. And so you have salespeople/purchasers. That's another place those can default from. Then you have customer template, which I haven't even looked at yet, but I see it in the code, customer temple, build to customer template code. So it appears that the dimensions can default from there. And then you have a responsibility center, which I'll talk about, which I had never heard of before. And then you have a campaign, not to further complicate things. And then on top of all of this, you have a job. And there may be other aspects of jobs, like maybe there's a job task or whatever it's called at the job level that you can default at. But I found code that references job. So here we have 9 different places where you could potentially define default dimension values. And so when you enter a transaction, it starts to get potentially confusing. Okay, so I enter an item on a sales invoice and I look at my dimensions and they're defaulting. Where are those defaults coming from? Is it the item, the customer, or if you're using a GL account, it could come from a GL account. It could come from the salesperson. It could come from a responsibility center maybe, or it could come from the company. I forgot to add company on here. I missed that. So make that 10 places in theory that you can, user is 11. So 11 different places in theory that these could come from. So it starts to get kind of crazy. So let's just take a look at the basic ones. These 9, let's ignore 10 and 11 for now. And let's take a look at default dimensions and default dimension priorities and see how that works. So there we go. Okay, so I'm just in a sandbox demo tenant for Business Central SaaS, and I'm going to go into a sales invoice, create a new sales invoice with what I hope is a customer that is not configured with any defaults. So I'm going to choose Alpine Ski House 40,000, and then I am going to choose the Paris guest chair because I think I don't have any defaults. And so you'll notice here, let me see if I can make that bigger. The customer group code and the department group code, those are my 2 global dimensions or shortcut dimensions. Confusing. I don't have any defaults, so those are blank. You're like, okay, maybe I want to default those so that the user isn't constantly having to choose something for every item, for every sales invoice. So let's take a look at how we can do that. So I'm just going to delete this. And so let's go to the item first. And so let's go to items. And that was my Paris guest chair. And it is not listed in the main item fields. You have to go to either item. Oh no. So it's confusing. The action menus are not my favorite. So although there is item here, I do not see dimensions. I have to go to related item dimensions. And it varies by record as to where that is. So I'm going to choose a customer group of, let's say, small, and I'm going to choose a department of sales. Okay, so small sales, and I'm going to leave my Paris guest chair. I'm going to go back to my sales invoice, and I'm going to choose the same Alpine Ski House. And I'm going to choose my Paris guest chair. And you'll notice now I have small and sales coming through because I define them as defaults, default dimension code values, default dimension value codes for this item. Cool. Now, what happens if I also assign defaults at the customer level? Because we can have these defaults defined at multiple levels. And one moment. Okay, so let's go to customers. Oops, spelled it wrong, but it still found it. Okay, so now I'm going to go to Alpine Ski House and define defaults on that customer. And here you'll notice that I can click on customer and I do have dimensions there, unlike items. I don't get it. You can also go to related customer dimensions. So I'm going to go to my customer and I'm going to assign default dimensions at the customer level as well. So let's see what happens. So I'm going to do a customer group of medium, so it's different than my item, and I'm going to do a department of prod. So medium prod instead of sales small. I'm going to exit out of my customer and I'm going to create a new sales invoice. I'm going to choose the same Alpine Ski House. And one thing you may notice is now that I've defined defaults for the customer, they now show up on the sales header. So they will default to populate department code and customer group code here, prod and, oops, you can't see it, prod and medium. What I noticed in my testing is when those default and these populate at the sales header level, they will stick with this invoice. So if you change the default values for this customer now, this invoice remains unchanged and these header values will stay in place. So if you have your line item dimensions default based on the customer through whatever defaulting mechanism you have, I found in my test they will default from here. They will not redefault from the customer. So the customer defaults copy to the header, and then if your line items are defaulting from the customer, they will default from here, not from the existing customer default value. So it's not going to go back to the customer and grab the values. It'll grab whatever is on this sales header. And Jeremy confirms, master data changes do not affect existing open documents, dimensions, or otherwise. So, yep, confirmation. And so that kind of tripped us up. We're like, why isn't it changing? Then we saw, it's already on the header. So BC looks to the header values first, defaults based on that. And only if these are blank, for instance, might it go back and pull them again from customer. And Eric notes, posting never happens from default. Okay, so I would have to explore that more to understand what that means. But let's just go with the defaults now and see how the line items behave. And so I have defined the defaults at the customer level and at the item level. We're seeing now that these defaults are coming into the invoice header. So what happens if I add my line item of Paris guest chair, which also has default dimensions? We see here that medium and prod come through. So we're seeing that the medium and prod are coming either from the customer defaults or from these department code, customer group code. Let's just do a quick impromptu test to see what happens here. Let's say that I delete this line, and even though I have these defaults here, let's delete them so we don't have anything at the header level. Okay, so I've cleaned out the defaults at the sales invoice header. Now let's re-add this line. Now that we have both item defaults and customer defaults, but we don't have item header defaults, what happens? In this case, it is defaulting back to the item. So it looks like the sales invoice is not actually pulling from the customer default values themselves. It's only using the customer defaults to copy defaults to the invoice header and then using those as the default for the line item. So I was previously saying that they default from customer first and then from item. Based on this test, I don't think this is accurate, or that description that I had is accurate. I'm going to have to update my blog post. It's actually copying from the customer to the sales header, and it defaults first from the sales header and then second from the item. So that's interesting observation. Okay, so that's a couple different ways, like essentially 3 different places that the defaults can come in to a sales invoice header. So you're starting to see how this can get a little confusing. And if you see small in sales, you're thinking, where's that coming from? And it will take a little research. Now, I don't know if there's an easier way to figure out where these are coming from, like some flow that shows, oh, these came from the item because you didn't have these other defaults in place. But you're starting to see there's some hierarchy going on. There are some predefined default priority mechanisms going on. And depending on how you have your default set up at the master record level or at a higher level, which I'll kind of show a few examples, you may need to do some sleuthing to figure out, why is this defaulting at small in sales? Is this a problem at the item level, at the customer level? Is this just an old open invoice that got it copied from the customer at that time and isn't reflecting changes? Is a salesperson involved? You know, like there are a couple different layers. Yeah, Jeremy says that would be a neat utility extension, dimension inspection. Yep, like where did this come from? And you could kind of reverse engineer the logic that BC is using to default this, and you could go up the chain and kind of show, okay, here are all your defaults. It's coming from layer 3, and that's why it's small in sales. I can imagine a complex environment that being valuable. Now, question though. 99% of, let's say 90% of customers use some simple defaulting mechanism. They don't have an elaborate default dimension set up. But for those few, those 10% that do have a multi-layer, complex, multi-location, multi-user, it could get really elaborate in terms of how they want their dimensions to default. So Eric follows up with a good point. Dimensions needed for GL entries, the customer default should eventually go to the AR posting, and the item default should eventually go to the ILE and sales post. So the way that my colleague Tanya described it is that these header dimensions are for your balance sheet, and the line item dimensions are for your income statement. And so that's how she differentiates these. And so it is kind of interesting that these headers will override what you have at the line item level. So you may need to be careful. And so in her case, I think she said she typically doesn't default the dimensions at the customer level because she doesn't want to override the balance sheet settings, but she will default them at the item level so that your income statement accounts get specified correctly. So item ledger entry. So if I'm remembering correctly, that was her description. So the sales header will go to balance sheet, your line items will go to income statement. So you need to understand, you don't want to just default these just so they show up on the line item correctly. You need to understand that this is also affecting how the general ledger or general journal entries, I guess, are created and what values are used there. Do you want balance sheet? Do you want income statement? And so that's another entire dimension, no pun intended, of where these are coming from. So it starts to get complex really quickly. So that was just a super simple example for just the one small use case that I was trying to research. And I'm already seeing like potentially confusing complexities and how this starts to interact. So we're now reconsidering like, do we really want to even default this stuff at all? Like, are we getting ourselves into trouble here? And we're thinking tentatively, okay, we'll default based off of the item and customer, but then we will deal with priorities, which I'll discuss next. But I think after that, we're like, yeah, that's the limit. Nope, we don't support more than that. We're going to keep it basic unless we run into use cases that are widely used by our customers to say, hey, we need this particular permutation of dimensions. And so, yeah, you're starting to see how this seemingly innocuous topic of default dimensions starts to get pretty involved. And it permeates everything you do throughout the system. So with that, okay. So I asked a seemingly innocent question. What about company defaults? And the reason I asked this is because I come from the Dynamics GP world, and we had a pretty simple system in Dynamics GP where if I enter a sales invoice with a line item, the default general ledger accounts, we don't quite have the same dimension concept in GP by default, like out of the box basic functionality. We have full GL accounts with multiple segments. So a GL account can default from a line item level, or it can also default from the customer level for the sales invoice, or it can default at the company level, or what we might call the system level. So is there a GL account for the items? Yes. If so, use those in your distributions. If not, go to the customer level. Is there a default GL accounts that I need to use for those? If so, pull those into the distributions. If not at the customer level, then look for any defaults at the system or company level and pull those in. And in theory, those three layers in a simple scenario will be enough to allow you to fully default all of your GL accounts, all of your debits and credits, and everything is taken care of. So in my mind, it seemed a little simpler, and granted, it had a little less flexibility. So if we wanted a particular segment of the GL account to change, like by location or by division or by item, then that was a little more difficult to do if we wanted just this one segment of the GL account. Whereas in Business Central, you can default those dimensions differently depending on what you need. So it's a little more powerful in that respect, in that you can adjust these different dimensions and have them default in from different places, but with potentially added complexity. So in my simple scenario, I was thinking item, customer, and company. Where could a company default come from? And so I asked on Twitter about this. Is there a way to define default dimension value codes at the company level or similar that will default if the item or customer or vendor don't have any defaults? And initially, I got some responses like, no, I don't think so. I'm not aware of a way. But then AJ chimes in with a knowledge bomb here. Yes, you can with a responsibility center. Set up a responsibility to include default dimensions. Set the default responsibility center in the company information card under shipping, and then the default dimensions will be applied to new documents. So it's trickling down from the company level. And he also notes a new twist to this. Responsibility center can also be configured in user setup, not to be confused with users, but user setup. Very interesting. So let's take a look at that. So under company default, or to default at the company level, you go to company information under the Shipping Fast tab, Responsibility Center. Now, a Responsibility Center it kind of looks like a site or a location for a company, and it has address, contact information, but it also happens to have your global dimensions or shortcut dimension 1 and 2 in there. So you can define those two values there. So in this case, I set up a hypothetical one of Los Angeles with a Los Angeles address like a warehouse, and that location could have global dimension or shortcut dimension 1 and 2 defined there. So I can set that at the company level. Now, here's the second place he mentioned, and this is the user setup, not to be confused with any other user windows. User setup, I specify my user ID, and then you see that I can have both the sales responsibility center and a purchasing responsibility center for this user, and that provides default dimensions at that level. So, I mean, these default dimensions can be coming at a transaction from 10 different directions. So you gotta be like, if you're going to use these, you don't have to use these features. Like this may be irrelevant for 80% of customers, but maybe Steve is in Los Angeles and you really want those Los Angeles dimension values to default for his transactions, whether that's on the sales or purchasing side. And you maybe Sally's in North Carolina and you want hers to be on the East Coast dimension values. So maybe that's appropriate for your business. So there you go. Now, from what I found, by default, this only applies to the two global dimensions or shortcut dimensions. Out of the box, I didn't see a way to default the other dimensions. So yeah, lots of scenarios you could come up with for how you use this. So let's take a look at that. So if I go back over to this screen, I still have my Alpine Ski House, and now I'm seeing that customers are overriding the item level because those dimensions are coming through at the sales invoice header. So let's play around. I'm going to keep this invoice in place and exit it. That's 2263. And so let's set up, let's see, what should I do first? Let's do the company first. So I'm going to go to company information and see, here's my company information page, and I have a responsibility center field here. So I'm going to choose Los Angeles. And let's just take a look at what that company information, responsibility center. So in the Los Angeles responsibility center, I have department code ADM, customer group large. So large ADM. And so I would expect large and ADM to potentially come through at the company level. So if I do a new sales invoice and I need to use a customer that does not have any default, School of Fine Art, and I'm going to choose an item that does not have any defaults, hopefully Athens Mobile Pedestal. And there we see large and ADM, they're not defaulting from the item or the customer. And if we scroll down, look at that. It's actually defaulting here in the sales invoice header. So got it. So this is coming through to the line item. So even though we don't have anything at the customer, those company defaults are coming through and populating at the sales invoice header. So you want to be careful about where you're defaulting, because my understanding is these will now affect your balance sheet accounts because these are at the header level or balance sheet entries, and it is defaulting in at the line level. Tricky. Okay, so I'm starting to really get out of my depth in terms of how these things interact in balance sheet and income statement. And Eric says you can set all dimension on responsibility center, just select related dimensions. Okay, let's check that out. Responsibility centers. Okay, related. Okay, responsibility, dimensions single, dimensions multiple. Okay, related, dimensions multiple. Okay. And that is all dimensions on all responsibility centers. That's prod and small. So, yep, lots of stuff going on here. I'd have to explore for a few hours. And the challenge I found is you can read the documentation and it says, oh, this is where you configure responsibility centers. Configure your responsibility center. And the documentation doesn't really do a great job of necessarily explaining the implications of these choices and how this flows through the system. So anyway, yeah, so it's starting to get involved here. So let me jump back here. So that was that was just an example. You can use responsibility centers to have these dimensions flow at the company or user level, and really adds complexity into the mix. And it looks like those are defaulting in at the sales header level, though it's not, and then that will be used to override at the item level. So what if you don't want that? What if, you don't want the sales header dimensions to override your items? So what do? Well, enter another twist. Dimension priorities. And so this, I didn't find the most intuitive window in the world, not having nav or much BC experience. And so you're greeted with this thing called source code. And I'm like, what? Source code? What does that even mean? And how do I know which source code I want for a sales invoice? And so just poking at the list and taking a educated guess, I chose sales, which appears to be what I wanted, but there are lots of others in there and I don't know where all of those are used. So you may need to explore and learn which source code that you want to use. So then I was just playing around and I noticed, well, you notice here priority 1 and 2. So it's like, okay, item is 1, customer is 2. That's your priority order, makes sense. So if you're entering these tables in, choosing these tables for default dimension priorities, it provides a default priority number for you. And then, look at that. I was just like, oh, what happens if I change the priority to all be the same number? I have no idea. You can change multiple table IDs to have the same priority, and I haven't had time to figure out what this does. I don't know why you'd want to do it. I don't think you would want to use it because this is horribly confusing to me. Like, what happens when salesperson and customer and item are all priority 1? Like, is that like crossing the streams in Ghostbusters? Like, I don't know. So I don't think I want to do this. It's kind of like, yeah. So Jeremy says it might be by table ID because you notice it is resorting the tables here by table ID. So probably not a good idea. I would prefer to be explicit on what my priority is because they're not going to come from multiple places. So yeah, Eric says it's the same as not having a priority. So I wouldn't want to do it, but let's check that out. Let's see if this actually works. So I'm going to go into my default dimension priorities. Okay. So I deleted my records just to start from scratch and just to show you what this looks like. It's like, as a new BC user, what in the world am I supposed to choose? And so I'm just like, sales, that sounds good. I don't think it's sales entry application. I don't think it's sales journals, and it's not service, and maybe there's something else that might apply, but sales looked like a good guess, so I went with that. And table ID. Well, I don't know table IDs. Like, I don't have those things memorized like you old school nav veterans do. There's a few here, right? Like, okay, well, if you go up to the top, I've kind of learned that's kind of a safe bet because up near the top, you kind of have your basic starter tables, shall we say. So customer, okay, customer sounds interesting. So I see item, so item, let's start with item. Okay, cool. Now I then have, I accidentally choose customer. So item and customer, that's kind of what I'm used to from the GP world. If it's in the item, use item. If it's in the customer, use customer. Now, this seems to come down to when we say default dimension priorities, based on my test, it looks like that's the default dimensions that will be used on a item when I add a line item to a sales invoice. It doesn't look like this is defaulting that from the header or changing the header defaults, but let's give that a try. I didn't actually pay attention to that. So you'll notice when I add this in, I get a default priority of 1 and 2. Perfect. So you can always change it and it reorders. So I can change customer to 1 and I can change item to 2. And so you can change this in any order at any point. And so I'm just going to make item 1, customer 2. Great. Now let's go back and let me just delete this. Let me do a brand new sales invoice. And let's see what happens. Okay, so I have no department code or customer group code. So the sales invoice header dimension values are currently blank. So I'm going to choose, okay, so I need to first just confirm that my customer has defaults and my item has defaults. So let's go over to customers. And I'm pretty sure my 50,000 customer does have default dimensions. Related customer dimensions. Yes, so I have medium and prod on this customer 50,000. Okay, so that's good. And now I want, under my items, I will have my Athens desk, related item dimensions, small and sales. Okay, so I've already forgotten what those were, but we know this one is small and sales and ADM prod, I think, on the other one. Eric says Alt D is the shortcut for dimensions. Okay, Alt D. So let's go to customers. And, oh, come on. Customers. I'll misspell it. Okay, so I'm going to go in my 50,000. Alt D. Look at that. Eric just saved me 20,000 clicks over the next 10 years. Thank you. Okay, so there's my dimensions, and let's do that at the item level. And Alt D. Alt D for dimensions, a shortcut that makes sense. There we go. Check that out. Super handy. Now, let me get out of my item card. Get out of my customer card. So we now know we have default dimensions at a customer and item level. So I'm going to choose, now on this, let me get back to my sales invoice. So my sales invoice still has no customer. It has no default header dimensions. And just curious, can I do an Alt D here? No. Okay. That kind of makes sense. So I'm going to choose a customer here. I'm going to choose my 50,000 customer. Now, prod and medium. So prod and medium apparently just defaulted from my customer. So it didn't come in from my the company default, whatever that was called. I've forgotten it already. It is called the responsibility center. Sorry. So it's not coming in from responsibility center. It's coming in from the customer. Now, if I add my item, which has different dimensions, I have dimension priority set up. Let's see what happens. I'm going to choose my Athens desk. We have small and sales. So in this case, in this demo, default dimension priority did override the default behavior of pulling from the sales header, and it has my items, whatever my item default dimensions, those pull on to the sales invoice line. So my understanding is that will affect our income statement accounts for this item, but will not affect our balance sheet accounts, which can come from the customer or company or even user. So hopefully I got that right, if that isn't horribly confusing. So I thought this would be as simple. It defaults from the item, it defaults from the customer, and maybe it'll default from the company. Turns out there's a lot of things going on, and there's the header, there's the line item. You can default in different places, company, user, salesperson, and you can change the priority of how those default in and potentially affect how they default into the balance sheet and income statement. So simple question. I ask these simple questions naively, having no idea what I'm getting into, and it turns out to be this maze of stuff behind the scenes. And so I have a question. Is the customer table even used at this level when entering the item? I would think the sales invoice header is being used. So at this point, I would agree. That's my observation. As soon as I choose the customer, BC is pulling the defaults from the customer or company or user into the sales header. And my experience in my testing is at that point, once that sales header default values are populated, that's what BC uses from that point. And the customer defaults are no longer relevant. It's only from the sales invoice header. If those defaults are specified, yep, that's what it's going to use. So that is my understanding of how it pulls. But you can, I suspect with the dimension priorities, actually, I believe I tested this, with default dimension priorities, you can say that customer is a higher priority than item. And I think that may potentially pull from the customer onto your line item. But that starts to get into some nonsensical scenarios, I think. Like you wouldn't want to necessarily do that. It's just not a common scenario. But maybe you have some customer that has some crazy scenarios where you default that. Or maybe you're using multi-entity management or some third party where that matters. But anyway, this was a unexpectedly confusing journey. And let me go back a few slides to the code. And so we thought, okay, we'll default the dimensions. And we just, our developer prototyped some basic defaulting code. Then we dug into this and we looked at this and found that what looked like code that was defaulting in these values. And yeah, we said, this is far more involved. And the question becomes, if we wanted to default the dimensions on a sales invoice line or our version of it that we're developing, where we have line items on essentially a sales document or a template, trade-offs. Do we attempt to use the Business Central code for defaulting those dimensions? Or do we kind of write our own watered down version of that deals with only certain scenarios? Now, one might say best practice is to use the BC code because it's defaulting in all these scenarios and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And what if it changes? Then you go with whatever their code is. But then you see how involved this is. And it's like, what if we aren't handling jobs? What if we aren't handling salespeople? Like, does it get too complex and messy? And are we getting ourselves into trouble by using the default, ironically? Well, then you say, well, if you write your own, you're not handling all these scenarios. And what if something changes? And what if you don't handle this particular scenario? You could get a bug and it may not upgrade and all this stuff. So like I normally say, let's use the base code and just call their code unit, call their procedure, whatever it is. But after looking at this, it's messy. And so I've asked for help from an expert. It's like, what do we do here? Like, it seems like we're going to get in a little trouble either way. What is the lesser of two evils? And so starts to get kind of messy here. So, oops, hey, I disappeared. So then a few wrap-up questions. That was pretty much my journey. One moment. There we go. So that was my journey with a very simple question of how do dimensions default? And that got into dimension priorities. That got into responsibility centers. That got into user and company defaulting and salespeople and jobs and campaigns, all sorts of places these defaults can come from. And then there's the balance sheet income statement, and then there's the sales invoice header. And do you want to override the line item, and how does that affect your financials? So Jeremy says, an unexpectedly complex journey could be the alternate title of my BC videos. Yeah, like I ask a seemingly simple, innocent question, and I'm like, oh my gosh, is nothing easy? So Eric asks, here's the real question. If you have separate customers for sell to and bill to on a sales order, How do you handle different dimensions on the two? Yeah. Yeah, it could get really crazy. And what if items ship from different locations, right? Um, I'm sure there are customers with really, really crazy scenarios. And at that point, I'd say, hey, are you in the 99th percentile? If so, you probably need a customization. And there might not be an expectation that Business Central should do this out of the box. Sorry. So yeah, it's like Business Central does provide a surprising amount of flexibility to provide dimensions, default dimensions, prioritize dimensions, have the dimensions come in from all sorts of crazy places. And now it's up to us to figure out, okay, given what the customer needs, wants, how they operate, where their data is flowing from, what makes sense and what limitations might you have? And then if it's moderately complex, as I mentioned, how do you figure out where these things are coming from? Because if you're using 4 levels of default dimensions, boy, that's going to get moderately crazy to troubleshoot. And as an end user who's just entering transaction, are they really expected to understand, am I getting the right dimension? Is it wrong? Is it defaulting from the wrong place? So you got to be kind of careful. And so in addition to that, say, dimension inspector feature that Jeremy proposed, do you need a dimension validation report? Like, what if this is wrong? How can you tell? And maybe it's just at month end in your reconciliation, you're like, why are all these entries against West Coast? Like, this doesn't make sense, or maybe against sales. And so I don't know, it starts to get complex. So, and to Eric's point, dimensions aren't just dimensions. You don't just add them arbitrarily. In theory, they should be driven by some accounting purpose, reporting purpose, analysis purpose, and like, what are you using dimensions for in the first place? And it's a metric that you're presumably measuring, and how do you want to use that? What is the business case for that? So lots of stuff going on in this seemingly simple question of default dimensions and dimension priorities. And with that, that is my exploration of just one Business Central feature. And with that, here's to a new series where I bumble through seemingly simple questions and get myself into really complex answers. And with that, have a good day. Cheers.